Before we begin, I'm going to reach out to Mrs. Sandra Parchment to consecrate the day's proceeding. Mrs. Parchment.
Your default has. Hello, good morning. Eternal Father, we humbly come before your presence this morning to give you praise, glory, and honor. Lord, we thank you for this day and the opportunity you have given us to participate in this, the 11th Annual National Health Research Conference. God, as we go through this COVID-19 experience, adjusting to the new normal, we ask that you guide the proceeding, dear Lord. God, we know you are omnipotent, you are omnipresent and omniscient. We know nothing takes you by surprise, and we believe you are working out your purposes in every situation. So we trust you to see us through. Lord, we pray for our Minister of Health, our permanent secretary, chief medical officers, and all of our health care workers, especially those on the front line who daily lay their lives on the line for us. Protect them and their families, Lord Jesus. Lord God, we also thank you for the strides we are making in dealing with this pandemic and pray for your physical, mental, emotional, and psychological strength and healing. Please take total control of these activities of today, and we pray that when we would have come to the end of this day, you will be pleased in what was said and done. Bless us as we pray in Jesus' name. Amen.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Parchment. And welcome again, everyone, our global and local audience. As I said earlier, thank you for rejoining or joining us on day 2 of the conference. Yesterday, we would have heard a bit about the epidemiology related to COVID, perceptions of the public a bit of psychiatric wellness, and importantly, we heard about technology as well. So it's very opportune that this morning we start off with a presentation on the Digital Protection Act. We're all concerned about confidentiality and privacy matters. And we have no one better placed to explain it to us and take us through it than Ms. Joaquin Murray. Ms. Murray is the Chief Technical Director with responsibility for information and communications technology in the Ministry of Science, Energy and Technology, and has held this position since 2012. She has been working in the field of ICT since 2003 and has over the last 17 years been exposed to and developed knowledge and expertise in the areas of telecommunications, electronic commerce, intellectual property rights, cybersecurity, and data protection. Ms. Murray is a graduate of the University of the West Indies and holds a Bachelor of Arts and a Bachelor of Laws from that institution. She was called to the Jamaican Bar in 2003. She also holds a Master's of Laws in Technology, Media, and Communications Law from Queen Mary University of London. All right, everyone, though we're virtual, I hope you will join with me to welcome Ms. Joaquin Murray to give her presentation. And I believe this piece of legislation is critical reading and understanding for all citizens of Jamaica. Welcome, Ms. Joaquin Murray. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation, first of all, to be a part of this conference. I appreciate that a review of the Data Protection Act in the midst of a National Health and Research conference might look kind of out of place, but I am grateful that I have been invited because, as our moderator has said, it's critical to the issue of privacy of data and the security of personal data. So today I'm going to quickly, within the time that has been granted, take us through a review of the legislation. It is a voluminous piece of legislation. It's not that easy to maneuver, and so I'm going to try and break it down as simply as I can so that all of us can be aware of what is to come. So as I go through this morning's presentation, we're going to be looking at a couple of things: the purpose of the Data Protection Act, the applicability of the Data Protection Act, the rights that have been granted to data subjects within the legislation, the obligations of data controllers, the enforcement elements of the legislation. I was asked specifically to look at the implication of the legislation on biometric data, and I'm going to do a couple of slides on that. And then, of course, I'm going to make some recommendations to us all. So the purpose of the Data Protection Act simply is to define the principles for processing personal data and to provide a transparent oversight to enable both persons, and I mean by persons, legal and natural persons, within both the public and private sector to strengthen how we manage the protection of personal data. I want to make the point that even though the Data Protection Act, as it is named, says data, we're not talking about data generally. The legislation specifically relates to personal data. And as I go through the presentation, I'm going to be introducing some terms and looking at what they mean. So when we talk about the applicability of the Data Protection Act, I want us to consider that to know that the Data Protection Act applies to data controllers that process personal or sensitive personal data and data of data subjects. And I've highlighted the words and underlined them. I think you're seeing them. But one of the things, so what I'm going to do is to just take us through what these terms mean in the context of the legislation and, of course, how it would impact both data subjects and data controllers. So who is a data controller? A data controller, by definition, is a natural or legal person or public authority who alone or jointly with others determines the purpose and the manner in which personal data is processed. There is a definition for public authority within the legislation, and it includes statutory bodies, public companies, or government companies, rather, commissions of parliament. So there is a definition, and it covers almost every single entity within the public sector. Additionally, a data controller is any person who has a legal obligation to process personal data. Now, with respect to the applicability, what we need to, one of the things that the legislation does is it establishes that a data controller is a person who is established in Jamaica or anywhere that Jamaican law applies. But it has, the legislation that is, an extraterritorial effect in that you can be considered a data controller for the purposes of the legislation, even if you're not established in Jamaica. But you process personal data using equipment located here, or you process personal data of individuals in Jamaica, and the processing activity relates to the offering of goods or services, whether for free or for a fee, and you're monitoring the behavior of individuals that take place in Jamaica. So whether you're established here or not, you are or may be covered by this piece of legislation. With respect to the term processing, that's a definition we're going to look at next. Processing means, by definition, and when I speak of the definitions, I'm speaking in the context of the legislation and how the legislation defines it, means obtaining, recording, or storing personal data. And a data controller who performs an operation or set of operations on data to include organizing the data, retrieving the data, disclosing it, blocking or erasing it, or even rendering the data anonymous. So when we speak about processing, we're really speaking about everything from the collection of the data, the personal data, to its destruction. Now, with respect to personal or sensitive personal data, those are the terms I'm going to go on to next. Personal data is defined as information, however stored. So that's whether it's stored manually or it's stored electronically, relating to a living individual or an individual who has been deceased for less than 30 years. Our legislation therefore applies to both the living and the dead for a period of time. And what is important is that that information can be used to identify an individual. So any information. So we talk about your name, your date of birth, your address, phone numbers, when collected, would be able to say, you're John Brown or you're Mary Jane. And that's what we mean by personal data. With respect to sensitive personal data, you'll see that those include genetic and biometric data, trade union membership, sex life, racial or ethnic origin, physical or mental health and condition, philosophical, religious, or other beliefs, among some others. Now, what is important here is that sensitive personal data is treated slightly different in the legislation from personal data. And as we go on, you'll see that what is required is explicit consent to process this type or these types of information or data. With respect to data subjects, a data subject is a named or otherwise identifiable individual who is the subject of that personal data. So having looked at who the legislation applies to, I want to make the point that the legislation does not apply to personal data processed solely for an individual's personal, family, or household affairs. So if, for example, you have your phone with contact information of your friends, your family members, colleagues, co-workers, which would include names, address, date of birth, and so on, that is not considered processing under the legislation because you're using, to the extent that, let me rephrase, to the extent that that information is used for your personal, family, or household affairs. So the legislation does not apply to that type of processing. Also, the legislation makes provision for some exclusion or exemptions from certain elements or provisions within the legislation. And those broad areas include national security, tax matters, the assessment and collection of tax, journalism, artistic and literary purposes, research purposes to include statistical and historical purposes, disclosures required by the law or by a court order, and matters as it relates to legal proceedings and obtaining legal advice. So moving now to the data subject's rights, there are 6 rights that have been established within the legislation: the right of access, the right to prevent certain processing, the right to prevent direct marketing, the rights automated decision taking, there is a right of rectification, and there is the right of data portability. And I'm going to treat with them very briefly with each. So with respect to the right of access, it's the right of the data subject to be informed whether a controller is processing data related to that individual, and that the provision of that information must be done free of charge. There is also the right, within the broader right of access, the right for a fee to have the data provided to the individual, and in a form that they can use. So if you think about our persons who are with disabilities, then it must be provided in a form that they will be able to access the information. Additionally, there is a right for a fee to be informed of the logic involved in a decision where the processing is by automatic means for evaluating matters concerning the individual, and is likely to be the sole basis for any decision significantly affecting the individual. So when you think about credit reports and the determining your credit worthiness, sometimes what is run is the data is the information with respect to you is run, and then they give you a number and they say this is your credit score. If the extent to which that is done automatically or purely automatically, in an automatic way rather, and that a decision is made about your credit worthiness solely on the basis of that number, then you have a right to know what informed that decision. There's also the right to prevent certain types of processing, and so what happens here is that the data subject is enabled to, by legislation, to say to a data controller, stop processing my data, cease processing, or don't even start processing my data because it's likely to cause substantial damage or distress, and the damage or distress is unwarranted, or the data that is being processed is incomplete or irrelevant, or additionally, the data ought not to have been, you shouldn't be processing the data in the first place, or the processing is prohibited by law. The final one that we have on screen is the data has been retained for longer than lawfully required. So if you should have destroyed the data and you're still using the data as a data controller, then the data subject can request that you cease the processing of that data. Then there's the right to prevent direct marketing, and I think we all know what direct marketing means, but there is a definition in the legislation, and it's when a data subject is approached, whether personally or electronically or by other means, for the direct or indirect purpose of promoting or offering to supply goods or services, or even requesting a donation of any kind or type, and for whatever reason. And with this right, the data subject can say to a controller, as a matter of fact, what the legislation says is that you can't process a person's data for the purpose of direct marketing. So when you see those messages coming in, whether into your email or onto your phone, that will soon have to actually come to an end unless your consent is given, or you're or you're a customer of the controller. So, and one of the things that the legislation says is that the data controller, cannot approach a data subject more than once to request consent. So it is an opt-in regime, meaning it is a data subject's right to say, I want you to send me information with respect to your organization or your company or your goods or services. But they can't just send you. It's something that you have to request. With respect to the right regarding automated decision taking, it's a little bit similar to the logic point I made earlier. And essentially what it says is that a data subject can notify a data controller not to make any decisions with respect to that individual solely on the basis of automated processing, particularly where that decision can significantly affect the evaluation of the person's, the affairs of the person. So when you think about your work performance, again, the issue of the credit worthiness and reliability on conduct, to name a few, the point here is that data controllers must apply their minds to the decisions that they take in relation to a data subject, and it can't be done just on an automatic basis or using an automated process solely, I should say. The second to last right is a right of rectification, and this allows the data subject to request rectification of any inaccuracy that might be in the data that is held by the data controller. And by rectification, we mean amending, blocking, erasing, or destroying the data. And the inaccuracies can include errors and omissions, errors or omissions with respect to that the personal data that is being processed. And then finally, just before finally, the rectification, if rectification is done, then the data controller is under an obligation within reason to notify every person to whom they would have shared that data within 12 months from the period, 12 months from the date that the request was first received. Finally, on the rights, the right of data portability. This right enables the data subject to have his or her personal data transmitted to another controller where it is technically feasible. And an example of that is if you are a customer with a bank, for example, and you want to change your account or move your account to another bank, you don't then have to provide the other bank with all the information that you would have given the first bank. You simply ask your existing bank to transfer your data to that second bank. So that's what essentially data portability is. With respect to the data controller's obligation under the legislation establishes 8 data protection standards to include processing the data fairly and lawfully. The data that is processed must be obtained for specified and lawful purposes and can only then be processed thereafter for the purposes that the data controller would have indicated to the data subject. The data must be adequate, relevant, and not excessive in relation to the purpose for the processing. And the data must be accurate and, where necessary, kept up to date. So those are 4 of them. The other 4, the data is not to be kept for longer than is necessary for the purpose. The data processed must be processed in keeping with the data subject rights, which I would have spoken about earlier. They must be safeguarded against unauthorized or unlawful processing. And finally, it cannot be transferred or ought not to be transferred to another jurisdiction that does not maintain an adequate level of protection. So that the jurisdiction or territory does not have itself a data protection regime. So with respect to the first standard, briefly, and this standard is standard 1, which speaks to processing data fairly and lawfully. Data must not be obtained by deception or by misleading the individual as to the purpose for which the data is collected. So the individual must know why you're collecting the data and what you're going to be doing with that data. With respect to the second standard, the data that is obtained must be processed for a lawful purpose. And what data controllers are going to be required to do is to explain to data subjects what it is that they intend to use their data to do. And whatever it is that you say you're going to do with it, that's exactly what you have to do with it, because any other processing for any other purpose then becomes unlawful. With respect to the third standard, this standard is basically saying data controllers ought not to collect more data than they need for the purposes that they're using it. I mean, I'm sure all of us have had the experience. You go and you fill out a form and they ask you 50 million things. And you're wondering to yourself, what does this have to do with what the goods or the service that I am procuring? And so this standard says that, listen, ask for what you need and no more than what you need. So data controllers will have to do an assessment of what it is that they really need to do, what to provide the service that it is that they're providing. The data must be accurate and where necessary kept up to date. Simply, this standard is saying that whatever data you collect must be verifiable. As a matter of fact, the data controller has an obligation to the extent practicable, verify the information that is provided by the individual, and would not be in breach of this particular standard if they can demonstrate that the information, one, was provided by the data subject, and two, they took the steps necessary to verify the data that was provided. With respect to the fifth standard about not keeping data longer than necessary, the legislation contemplates that regulations will be developed to guide person as to how long to retain certain types of data. I think some of us in the public sector already know that there are pieces of legislation that determine how long you keep certain things, 60 years for like personal matters and so on. The seventh standard is a critical standard. All the standards are critical, but this particular one places an obligation on data controllers to take appropriate technical and organizational measures to guard against unauthorized or unlawful processing or accidental loss, damage, or destruction. So we're getting into protecting and securing the data here. And in carrying out this particular standard or implementing this standard, the data controller must take steps to ensure that persons who access the data adhere to the security measures. If it is that you use a third party to process the data, you are required to ensure that that data processor provides sufficient guarantees regarding the security of the data and report breaches to you as a data controller. Additionally, those relationships have to be in writing. There has to be a written contract, and an obligation must be placed on the data processor to comply with this particular standard. The final standard is the standard in relation to the transfer out of the jurisdiction of data, the data subject's personal data. And as I said earlier, while this is prohibited, but there are some exceptions. There's always exceptions. So how do we determine adequacy? We're going to look at the territories or the jurisdictions laws, the nature of the personal data that is being transferred, any security measures in that other country to ensure the protection of the data, and the purpose and the period during which the data are to be processed in that other country. Just to say, though, that with consent, the data controller can transfer to another country once they have the consent of the data subject to do so. So if the data controller is to transfer data to Timbuktu, and Timbuktu doesn't have laws in place to protect the data, if the data subject consents, then that transfer can be done. Some other obligations under the legislation: data controllers will be required to register with the commissioner unless they fall within a category of data controllers or processing that the minister determines ought not to register. Additionally, controllers will be required to appoint a qualified person as a data protection officer, just to say that all public authorities will be required to appoint such a person. And what this person does is to independently monitor the controller's compliance with the legislation to ensure that there is no contravention of it, and will assist data subjects in the exercise of their rights. Additionally, with respect to data protection officers, one of the things that they will be required to do is, if it is, they say to the data controller that you're breaching or there are errors of non-compliance, and that data controller fails to adhere to the advice of the data protection officer, then the data protection officer is under an obligation under law to report the matter to the commissioner that is established within the legislation. Some persons have found it a little bit strange that that can happen, but it really is an audit function. It operates like an audit function and helps to keep the data controller compliant. The other thing I want to bring to attention is the fact that controllers will be required to notify the commissioner and the data subjects of breaches. I believe that this is probably the first piece of legislation that requires that where there is a breach of security in relation to personal data, data controllers are under an obligation to tell the data subject. I think we would have heard a lot of incidents where persons, cybersecurity threats, invasion, and loads of information is just out in the public in relation to persons. And what they're asking persons to do, what this piece of, well, what the provision requires is that the data subject must be notified within a reasonable time of becoming aware of the breach, so that that individual can take steps to mitigate any potential fallout by the fact that their information has been leaked or accessed by whoever. Additionally, there will be a requirement for a data protection impact assessment to be done and submitted to the commissioner annually. And it will include, effectively what this is requiring data controllers to do is to do an assessment of the processing that they're doing, the possible risk if there is a breach, and then to indicate how it is that they would mitigate those risks. With respect to the enforcement, I've been speaking about a commissioner, but the legislation establishes the Office of the Information Commissioner, and that office will be responsible for monitoring compliance with the legislation, providing advice to both the minister and as well as the public. And if the office so believes that it can mandate or encourage groups of persons or data controllers to develop guidelines that would help them to adhere to good data protection practices. Additionally, the Information Commissioner will be responsible for investigating complaints raised by data subjects and may, on its own initiative, investigate how it is that data controllers are complying. The office is empowered to issue enforcement, assessment, and information notice, and will have powers of entry and so on. The offenses, there are several offenses created in the legislation. They range in terms of the fines from about $1 million to $5 million in the parish court, and fines are at large in the Supreme Court. With respect to possible terms of imprisonment, those range from about 6 months to 10 years. The point here that body corporates are liable to a fine, sorry, not exceeding 4% of the annual gross worldwide turnover. So if there is a breach for those companies that are found liable, they can be fined up to 4% of their gross annual turnover. And the fines, or some of the offenses treat with the breaches of the data protection standards, which I would have discussed. Selling information is one thing. So, you know, those instances where persons have been complaining about their information being sold, that's an offense under the legislation and attracts a fine of $5 million up to 5 years or 10 years in the Supreme Court or Circuit Court. With respect to quickly the implication on biometric data, just to say that if we think about biometric data, at first there has been an evolution. Initially, you know, biometric data would have been used for DNA and fingerprint testing, but what we're increasingly seeing is that biometric data is being used for automated authentication or verification and identification for access to physical or virtual spaces. So people are using it on their phones to access or to get into their buildings and so on. So with this rapid technological evolution, what it raises is the issue of security, one, and the issues of data protection. The legislation defines biometric data in Section 2, and it is any information about the physical, physiological, or behavioral characteristics that allow the unique identification of the individual. And with respect to the physical characteristics, those include facial image, fingerprints, iris scan, your height, your vein pattern, and so on. But additionally, it also can include your behavioral characteristics, so the way that you walk, the way that you sign, your signature, the way how you type, or your voice can be considered within the definition, or certainly is considered within the definition of biometric data. With respect to the legislation and the impact on biometric data, first thing to note is that the data protection applies to biometric data. Act applies to biometric data, except where I'd said before, if it's being used purely for personal or household purposes. The DPA, we would have seen as well, defines biometric data as being included in that class called sensitive personal data, which it means that you can't collect this data without explicit consent. So it must be processed in keeping with all the 8 standards we would have reviewed earlier. And in processing that biometric data, you can only lawfully do it if one of the conditions of Section 24 is met. And again, that's because it's considered sensitive personal data, so there must be written consent. You can process it without consent if you fall into these other situations. One, you need it, for example, for medical purposes, for legal proceedings, or to protect the data subject's vital interest, their life, or the life of some other third person. With respect to consent, consent must be given, the consent given must be informed, specific, unequivocal, and freely given, meaning they must know what purpose they're providing the data for. The biometric data is going to be used for, and it must be done free of their own volition. And then finally, with respect to biometric data, the data subject may at any time, and this is generally, not only with respect to biometric data, this is generally a general provision within the legislation related to all sensitive data. A data subject may at any time withdraw consent to the processing of his or her sensitive personal data. So even if given, the consent can be withdrawn at a later date. So as I wrap up, I have just some recommendations to make generally to persons, particularly those who would be processing personal data. One, review the legislation. Yes, it's a long act, but it's imperative because it applies to both private and public sector entities. Review the legislation to determine whether or not you're a controller and thereby captured by the legislation. If you are a controller, then you need to do a couple of things. You need to consider what personal data you're collecting, whether the personal data being collected is necessary, who you're sharing the data with, the jurisdictions, if any, that you're transferring the data to in the context of transfer of data, and how long the data will be retained for. We're encouraging data controllers to establish their own privacy policy statement that allows for transparency, and of course it must be written in such a way that clients and customers can understand it, right? But they need to know what are your privacy policy rules in relation to the use of or processing rather of their personal data. Controllers are encouraged to assess the technical and organizational measures necessary to ensure that the data is kept secure. And that will be an involved process, but your MIS officers or IT officers or managers will have work to do in that regard. Review your contracts, including those with data processors, to ensure accountability and compliance with the Data Protection Act. And of course, review your operational processes to ensure that you can give effect to the data subject's rights. So if it is that the data subject, for example, says that they don't want to receive direct marketing or they don't want to be direct marketed, then you must have a system in place once you receive that notification to be able to desist from doing it. So that in a nutshell, not much of well, about 30 minutes of it, but that it is the simplest breakdown I can give you of the legislation, even though we didn't go into a lot of the things, and I want to thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mrs. Murray. I think you did an excellent job of presenting it in such a way that we could understand it. It's a very weighty and technical area, but it's essential reading, as I said earlier, for all citizens of Jamaica. And I want to commend you on the way you presented it. I certainly would like to read your presentation along with the actual legislation to come to a better understanding of the language and the intention of the clauses. So commendation to you again on a job well done. At this time now we'll turn to the audience. I know controls will help me here to identify the questions. I believe we have quite a few in the Q&A section. And if possible, we'll go to those on Facebook and YouTube, if time permits.
Okay, first question. If biometric data is collected from you as part of an application for free, say for example passports, etc., why is it for a fee, and should you be charged for your data being collected?
Well, the legislation doesn't speak to, okay, let's step back a little bit. The data is yours. Your personal data is yours. And that's one of the things we want to establish first of all. And you have constitutionally a right to privacy. If you choose to give your information, then you give your information on your own volition. It's not that we're encouraging persons necessarily to pay you for the use of your data. If it is that that's an arrangement that the data controller wants to enter into, then you're allowed. But what we're saying is, if anyone who collects your data, whether the goods or the services that they are selling you is for free or for a fee, then they're obliged to ensure that they protect the data that you provide and to process the data in accordance with the legislation. The fact is that I think we appreciate that everywhere you go, once there is a product or goods or services that are going to be provided, you think about your doctors, you think about your lawyer, you think about your utility companies. They collect information in relation to you to provide you with a service. And that service you might be paying for, or you may not be paying for it. But the idea here is that if you give it willingly, and they must obtain your written consent to take it. So with respect to the biometric data, if you purchase a phone and then you determine that you're going to be using your biometrics, your fingerprints, your facial impression to access your phone, that's a choice you make because you don't have to do it. What you have to appreciate as the individual now is that your data is now in a system somewhere, and you're hoping that Google or whoever is operating within their jurisdiction under some privacy data protection law that protects you. And more importantly, they are taking the necessary steps to ensure the security of the information that they have in relation to you.
Next question is there a central repository for data for each person? If you, as the data subject, make a request for erasure of data and it is not done, what are your rights? And what are the sanctions if the request for deletion of data are not completed? If you're made aware of transfer or of other processing of data, then what are your rights?
All right, so I don't know that there is a central repository for data. Each data controller, and by data controller we mean any business, any person who is collecting the data for the purpose of providing a service. So there is no central repository. Within the legislation, you are provided with protection. One of the rights I would have discussed is the right to access, and that right enables any individual to go to any data controller or any entity and say, are you processing data in relation to me? And that data controller has to tell you whether or not they are processing data in relation to you and what information generally it is that they're processing. Now, if you want the data on you, then you will pay a fee to collect that, to get that data. But you are enabled by the legislation to exercise your right of, first of all, knowing whether or not someone is processing your data, and then secondly, accessing that data as well. Bearing in mind, though, a point I dealt with very briefly, that there are exceptions within the legislation. So if you go to the police, for example, and say to them, you know, do you have data on me and what you're doing with it? They can tell you no, because for national security purposes, they ought not to be divulging that they're conducting an investigation in relation to you. So there are exceptions. It's not a general right. There are exceptions, and there are activities within the built into the legislation that are exempt from some provisions in the legislation. That particular question was a loaded one. I don't even know if I caught every single issue, but I'm hoping I did. All right, so I think that's it. Thank you so much for your attention, and I trust. Just to say one last thing with respect to the legislation. The legislation contemplates that it will come into force on a date to be appointed by the minister. The legislation is not yet in force. The ministry is moving to, first of all, establish the Office of the Information Commissioner. Once that is done, then the minister will indicate when the legislation will come into force. And data controllers will have 2 years from that date to begin to to get their house in order and to ensure that they can be compliant with the legislation. So the legislation, while not in force, we're encouraging persons as a ministry to familiarize themselves with it, because it is coming, and it's something that everybody will be required to comply with. Thank you.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I believe we still have some more time for questions. If it's possible for Ms. Murray to look at the Q&A window and take a few more questions. Am I right, controls? Do we still have some time?
There is feedback, but just to say that we're trying to get back on time. So we have asked Ms. Murray to respond to the questions in the chat while we continue with the conference.
Okay, okay. All right, then I believe we're concluding this session then. And I speak on behalf of everyone when I again want to extend our appreciation to the presenter for the clarity and the simple language used to communicate. I mean, this is a intense legal piece of legislation, and she certainly broke it down a lot for me. I come away with a whole heap of appreciation about my right to consent, for example. I thought it was annoying that every time I visit particular web pages, I'm asked every time about cookies. So now I understand why they need to get my consent every time. And I found it also very interesting that my biometric data extends even to how I comport myself, my gait, my body posture, and the rest of it. Very enlightening. So I want to encourage everyone to to visit the ministry's webpage for the conference. You'll see the conference booklet. I want you to take a look at the posters on the webpage as well. Be sure to look out for the conference form evaluation form, I should say, sorry, and complete them. And so as we wrap up this session, we'll be taking a quick little program break. No, actually, yes, a quick little program break, unless again, I said, if controls has changed that, we'll have a quick little program break, and then we'll go into the next session, which is the scientific session on sickle cell disease. So thank you again, everyone, for joining, and enjoy the rest of the day.
The following is brought to you by MOCA, the major organized crime and anti-corruption agency with kind support of NIA and USAID.
Criminal minds think they are cunning. The major organized crime and anti-corruption agency have them running. Your friend a shout, come scam. Take time running, are we ready for the ops? Drive up on your block, step out now me block, cyber take about your laptop. Pull up every lock, no evidence to drop. We put it in a cuffs and now we have the underground. Sin you say scam, you better look out fit. When you move corrupt, better look out fit. Feel say you get wet, look out fit. Look out fit, look out fit. From you say scam, you better look out fit. When you move corrupt, better look out fit. Feel say you get wet, look out fit. Look out fit, look out fit.
The proceeding was brought to you by MOCA, the major organized crime and anti-corruption agency with the kind support of NIA.
On your program, I am going to be your moderator for this third scientific session of the second day, coming into the second day of the Ministry of Health and Wellness Annual Research Conference. So let me firstly join in the congratulations, first and foremost, to the National Epidemiology Unit, led by Dr. Webster Carr and, of course, Dr. Andreen Grant, as the chief organizer for the annual research conference, and congratulate the team for doing an excellent job so far for the beginning for this year, which has been a very unprecedented year for a lot of activities. We have come with a research for this year with the theme adjusting to the new normal for COVID-19, and one of those new normal is this issue of exemplifying a virtual world that we live in, and now we are staging the conference on a virtual platform for the first time, I believe, from the conference team, and I must again commend the team for doing a really, really great job to staging it so well, bringing together excellent researchers, presenters, and again, to start off the second day, with a very important topic, which is the whole issue of data protection. As we go into this virtual platform, we have a lot of information coming through. So it sets the stage, I believe, to appreciate where we need to go. There is an error on your program. You will have noticed that it says sickle cell disease for this segment. We are actually completing the mental health focus for the presentation for this year, which is a priority area for the Ministry of Health and Wellness. And in this third session, we have two very brilliant presenters who are going to carry through a key dimension in the whole new normal, the mental health consideration, and we're going into two different perspectives for the mental health aspect of COVID-19. We have two presentations for this third scientific session. This first one, over the next 15 or 20 minutes or so, we're going to take from Mrs. Patrice Whitehorn-Smith. Mrs. Patrice Whitehorn-Smith holds a Bachelor's of Science degree in Psychology and a Master's of Science degree in Clinical Psychology from the University of the West Indies. Mrs. Whitehorn-Smith is currently pursuing her doctoral degree at Curtin University in Western Australia, again the virtual world, where she's a recipient of the prestigious Australian Government Research Training Program Stipend Award, and we must congratulate her on receiving that award. She's currently collaborating with the Department of Community Health and Psychiatry at the University of the West Indies by coordinating the research activities of Mental Health Research Group around mental health and COVID-19. She has worked in the area of mental health, substance abuse treatment, and research. She has over a decade of experience working on the development and implementation of regional and national level research projects. And this morning, she is going to present her paper, Socio-Demographic Correlates of Depressive and Anxiety Symptoms Among Jamaicans During the COVID-19 Pandemic. Please help me welcome Mrs. Patricia Whitehorn-Smith to deliver her presentation.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you for the opportunity to present today. Okay, so as was stated earlier, we did a study looking on the socio-demographic correlates of depressive and anxiety symptoms among persons in the Jamaican population. And this is actually done by a team of us, as was stated earlier, who work as a mental health and drug use research group within the Department of Community Health and Psychiatry at the University of the West Indies. So I really want to highlight the members of the team, Dr. Daniel Oshie, Ms. Shinwendu Agu, Professor Wendell Abel, Ms. Gabrielle Mitchell, Dr. Althea Bailey, Dr. Joy Harrison, and Dr. Kian Campbell-Williams. So I want to acknowledge their contribution to the development of this study at this time. Okay, so as we know, we're in the day 2, so we are fully aware that we are in the middle of COVID-19, and it is the biggest, I will call it, drama in our lives since a century now. So the presence of this pandemic has caused a fallout in many areas of our lives. And throughout the world, we're seeing where mental health has been greatly affected, mainly because of the presence of this disease that's highly contagious, but also because of the mitigating factors that have been put in place to help to curtail it. So recent international studies have shown that depressive and anxiety symptoms have been linked to persons feeling more fearful about possibly contracting the disease and the consequences of being in quarantine, lockdown, isolation, and all these different changes that have happened in our lives. We see where there are socio-demographic factors, for example, gender and employment status and age, that have been associated with this mental health crisis, and also the level of knowledge people have about this disease and their current practices. So within our Jamaican context, we recognize since March, we ourselves have experienced a lot of changes in our reality as ways of coping with and mitigating against COVID-19 in our own societies. society. This includes changes to persons' lives around job loss, family strain, your children being out of school, loss of your routine, and social contact. For us, being able to touch is a big part of our culture. So all these aspects are possibly affecting the well-being and the mental health of those around us. So based on that, we felt it was very important to look quickly at how the mental health of our population has been affected due to the presence of COVID-19. And so we had two primary objectives. First was to look into the prevalence of the depressive and anxiety symptoms among the population, and then two, to look at what socio-demographic factors could be associated with this heightened depression and anxiety if that were present. Okay, so to accomplish this, we really wanted to get quick and speedy results that would be able to allow us to quickly make recommendations of areas that the Ministry of Health and us as researchers and persons in mental health could focus on. So we did a descriptive cross-sectional study design and used a rapid online survey. This survey was conducted between August and September, so it's a very recent findings. We targeted persons between the ages of 18 and older who are currently living in Jamaica. We used Facebook as our recruiting platform, so you had to have an active Facebook account. Our instrument was a self-administered questionnaire. It focused on socio-demographic backgrounds, knowledge, attitudes, and practices around COVID-19, how persons were coping in terms of well-being, and serious issues related to mental health. We used two standardized tools, which were the Patient Health Questionnaire 2, which is a 2-point brief screen assessment for depressive symptoms. That allows us to be able to tell if there's a possibility of major depressive disorder and if further screening is necessary. We also use a generalized anxiety disorders tool, which is also a 2-point scale, standardized globally. It's a measure of generalized anxiety, as well as has been found useful for other common anxiety disorders, such as panic disorder and so on. We were able to get ethical approval both from the Ministry of Health and Wellness and from the UWI Faculty of Medical Science Ethics Committee. We used a wide range of data analysis steps, including doing univariate and bivariate analysis, and we did binary logistic regression as our multivariate analysis, where depressive symptoms were considered as significant depressive symptoms or insignificant, and significant anxiety symptoms or insignificant, based on the scoring system of the scales used. All right, so let's quickly look at what we found. The vast majority of those who responded were female. So before I jump into the results, just a quick point. We used Facebook as a recruiting tool. We did not collect personal information. So persons were asked to look at, they were shown Facebook ads would come up in their feed. It was targeted using a digital marketer to stratify different population bases to attract them to do the survey. Once they clicked the link, it took them to another platform, which we didn't have access to any of their Facebook information. And then we set the survey so that we would not track email addresses or IP addresses. So it was anonymous. Just want to put that there. So we largely got female respondents, and the most common age group that was represented was those between 31 to 40 years and 41 to 50 years. Go ahead. All right, it's really hard to see this, but I really wanted to show it. We looked at urban and rural. Most persons were from urban areas who responded. Christianity was the dominant religious group. Most persons were single, followed by married. And the education level varied. We had a large amount of persons with undergraduate and graduate degrees responding and vocational training. Now, in terms of employment status, we see that most persons, well, not most, a significant amount were employed, and the remainder were full-time employed, and the remainder were employed on different levels or unemployed. Unemployed represented 32% of the respondents. All right, in terms of employment category, we had persons who were mostly professionals. We had a large professional group, and varying different occupational categories were represented throughout the study. All right, this is really important, I think, because we found in the study that persons stated that since COVID-19 started, 57.2% of them had experienced a change to their job status. Many of them had lost their jobs, they had had salary cuts, they had been placed on redundancy, or had gotten fewer contracts than they did before. We see there that 39.9% had lost their jobs. Okay, in terms of knowledge of COVID-19, we saw that the vast majority of those who responded were very well aware of COVID-19. So the Ministry of Health is doing an excellent job in helping persons to be aware of how COVID is transmitted, how infectious it is, and providing information to them. As you see, the lowest score there is 92% had heard a great deal about COVID-19. So that's a job well done. Now, as it relates to depressive symptoms and anxiety symptoms, and this now speaks to significant levels according to the scoring system. And we see where 54.7% of the respondents had significant depressive symptoms. That's more than 1 in 2, that's 1 out of 2 persons. Well, it is a slightly more than 1 out of 2 persons that had depressive symptoms. And anxiety symptoms was at 49.2%, which is almost 1 in 2, which is very significant. In terms of chi-square analysis, which was done on the categorical data, we see where it ran parallels for both depressive and anxiety symptoms, where age groups, marital status, education level, employment status, and changes in employment, those repeatedly stood out as the primary areas linked to depression and anxiety symptoms among the population. We see where, particularly for marital status, go back please, marital status, there was an even greater significance for anxiety symptoms than depressive symptoms among the population. Next. Okay, so this chart is just a quick snapshot, visual snapshot of what our binary logistic regression found. I'm going to talk about it some more, but just for you to quickly see, as it relates to depressive symptoms based on our regression model, what stood out as the top 3 areas of concern for depressive symptoms was education level, age, and employment status. That being said, it means persons who had significant depression tended to be younger, tended to be unemployed, and tended to have lower levels of education. For anxiety symptoms, we see where age, younger age, and education, lower education level were more significantly associated there and predictive. Okay, for this table, let's flesh it out a little bit more quickly. So as it relates to the age groups, the reference group for the age groups was persons 61 and over. So compared to persons 61 and over, those persons who fell in the age group 18 to 25 years were 11.9 times more likely to have depressive symptoms. Do you see how massive that is? Those in the 26 to 30 years old age group were 3 times more likely. So as you see, the younger age groups stood out strikingly at being at greater risk at this time. Also for anxiety symptoms, we see it's 4.5 times more likely. for 18 to 25 years and 2.5 times more likely for 26 to 30 years. Very important point. Again, as it relates to employment, those who were unemployed were more likely to have depressive symptoms. For education level, those with secondary schooling or lower were 3.5 times more likely to have depressive symptoms and 2.1 times more likely to have anxiety symptoms. So we see these things are standing out clearly as major areas for us to pay attention to. Now, interestingly, when asked at the end of the survey if persons think they needed additional support to cope during COVID, a whopping 67.4% of people felt like they need some help to cope with what's happening at this time. So what have we figured out from the data that we've collected? Clearly, there's a high prevalence of depressive and anxiety symptoms at this time. This is not unusual. Studies that have been conducted throughout the world, especially in China and India and other places that are having high rates of COVID-19, have shown an increase of over 50% of the population having anxiety and depressive symptoms. There is a persistent comorbidity of depressive and anxiety symptoms. Again, this is consistent with a pandemic and with what international studies are showing. Again, women and younger age is in keeping with what we're seeing globally. However, in contrast, whether persons lived in urban or rural areas did not matter, and marital status didn't show up in the multivariate analysis as being a predictor, according to the model of anxiety and depressive symptoms. So we also saw where employment and changes to employment were persistently significant concern for anxiety and depressive symptoms among persons. So unemployment has been listed as a significant risk factor for developing mental disorders. So that is a big issue to focusing on as well. All right, so how do we address this? So the good thing is that the Ministry of Health and Wellness has done a lot of work, I think, sensitizing the population and especially the elderly about what to do to stay safe and to protect themselves. But as we're seeing from the findings of this study, the young people really need some help. So it's about how can we now develop targeted mental health programs toward young adults. Obviously, they're utilizing the social media platforms, and online resources can be made available for persons who are in need of these support at this time. We saw where lower educational levels are also a big concern. Our suggestion is to look at community-based mental health outreach, whether through the health services within the different parishes or through partnerships with faith-based organizations and other civil society groups. Employment, that one is a serious one. We see where there have been efforts by the government through the CARE program to assist persons, but we still have to think of alternative strategies to help persons who have lost their job, to ease that burden, to help ease these mental health concerns. Okay, so in quickly looking at the strengths and limitations of this research that we did a rapid online survey, which was excellent, I think, in terms of allowing us a quick turnover time with the results, and time-sensitive, social distancing. All these things were a benefit from that type of survey approach. We were able to collect information on a wide range of issues, and this is one of the first studies now out that actually focused on anxiety and depression. Of course, the biggest limitation of our study was that we had an overrepresentation of females, so we really weren't properly able to assess the gender dynamic. And so in moving forward, we have to find a way to get the men involved to see how they are doing and include them in what's happening. We also know this is a rapid study, so again, that also has its limitations because it's a snapshot. And so we don't know how, generalizable it is beyond the moments that we got that data. Okay. And of course, the challenges of using an online survey, which comes with its own selection bias. You have to be on Facebook. Not everybody is on Facebook. So we recognize those limitations. All right, so just giving you an idea of the references, and I would like to say thank you so much for your time in listening to this presentation and for allowing us to share what we found. Thank you.
Mrs. Whitehorn-Smith, that was a really excellent presentation, very excellent subject matter that we have looked into, emphasizing a critical point that we have identified, certainly from the national level. You would have heard our executive team members from the level of our minister highlight the importance of mental health consideration, the stress on the point of livelihoods, and more importantly, our younger population that is being adversely affected. And it just underpins the point and the whole purpose of the research that the Ministry of Health National Epidemiology Unit stages every year to gather information on the local population that can be translated into policy and procedures that will augment overall the health status of the population. So I must commend you on the team, your research team as well, and for looking at the area. And again, just to bring back to the point of what we need to, what the purpose of this conference is, to provide scientific data that we can act on. I'm gonna move straight into the next presentation. Just to remind our participants that it is a blended approach, in person and virtual, and so our IT team has set up a really good structure to allow for your questions and comments to come in real time. So use the chat feature on the platform to type through your questions and comments. Our team members at Control here are gathering the information, and our presenter will be able to respond both online and in person as is necessary, so we can make up on time. So just to remind participants, use the online feature to provide your questions and comments. So we're going to move on to our next presentation, which is coming to us virtually from Ms. Marisa Stubbs. Ms. Marisa Stubbs currently holds MSc in Clinical Psychology from the University of the West Indies. She is employed as an associate clinical psychologist at a private practice and as a researcher at the Caribbean Institute for Health Research at Mona campus of the University of the West Indies. Her research interests include well-being across the lifespan, the interplays between mental health and physical health, and how psychopathology impacts how we use the internet. Ms. Stubbs is currently working as a researcher on the Jamaica arm of a multi-country dementia care improvement study called Strengthening Responses to Dementia in Developing Countries, acronym STRIDE. This project is coordinated by the London School of Economics, with research being conducted in 7 developing countries to understand and inform national and individual practice and policy for people living with dementia and their carers. So she is going to bring to us virtually the experiences of caregivers of persons living with dementia in Jamaica during the COVID-19 outbreak. Please help me welcome Ms. Marisa Stubbs.
Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for that introduction. So today I'm going to be discussing the experiences of caregivers of persons living with dementia in Jamaica during COVID-19. I'm a researcher on the STRIDE Jamaica team, and I'm representing the rest of my teammates today. And this includes Rochelle Amore, Janelle Robinson, Nicholas Elias, Sarah Drew, Emily Freeman, and Ishta Gavaya. So today I'll provide some information just briefly about the STRIDE project and also get into the background, methods, findings, and conclusions that we found from our study. So as mentioned in my bio, the STRIDE Dementia Project is taking place in 7 developing countries, and this includes Brazil, India, Indonesia, Jamaica, Kenya, Mexico, and South Africa. And the whole aim is just to improve dementia care support in these countries. And Jamaica is actually the only Caribbean country involved. And so we're very proud and excited to be able to not only build research capacity, but also continue building on the research to improve care for the persons living with dementia and their carers. So to give you a background about the study, we know that the pandemic came about, the first case came in March, and it represents a potential crisis for persons caring for people living with dementia, just because we know that older persons are more at risk for the more fatal effects of the virus. So when we recognize that this pandemic and the ordinances, the curfews, the restrictions with social gatherings, these aspects to mitigate the spread of the virus, we recognize that it would affect the way that carers provide their care, because it'll impact on their ability to engage with their social networks who probably aided in providing care, and also it'll affect the availability of certain services that they needed to access in a part of their care routine. And so we recognize that we needed to understand their experiences, because this is going to guide and highlight what type of resources are needed for these persons. So moving on to the methodology, we had about 27 participants, and this included 23 females and 14 males. Because the participants were persons who we had previously engaged with as carers in the Kingston and St. Andrew area, most of their experiences represented what it was like for them during the pandemic living in Kingston and St. Andrew. And so our data collection was virtual, and it occurred via the telephone. And this was either through telephone calls or WhatsApp calls. And this was all based on the preference of the participants, whatever they felt the most comfortable with. So for the telephone data collection, we, as a team, we developed a script just to make sure that there was a standardized way that we engaged with participants. We covered all the necessary information and gained the necessary consent that was required for this study. And so this script spoke about an update with our project, because at the moment we had to pause field work when the first case was announced. And so we gave them an update on the study, and then we also asked them if they would feel comfortable sharing their experience with us. And we told them the purpose of collecting this data. We also discussed with them any support needs that they may have. So while we are a research project, we only have the capacity to provide support to community resources through providing awareness to these resources. And so as we spoke with participants, and they indicated that they required maybe grocery delivery or medication pickup, and we were aware of services that could support this, we shared that information with them. However, if it was something that was outside of our capacity, we made it very clear, like, you know, we won't be able to support you in this way. The information from the telephone data collection, it was documented, and then it was analyzed using the thematic analysis. And we pulled out the major themes that were consistent as we discussed their experiences. So the findings and the results. One of the major findings that came out with the participants was the challenges around mobility during lockdown. So we know that there was a specific stay-at-home order for persons who were 70 and older. And for most of our participants, this is the age group that the person that they're caring for fell in. And so this meant that for the most part, persons were homebound. They didn't really have the opportunity to be able to go out anymore. And this presented a challenge for carers. So while some persons were able to try to move their loved ones maybe outside to get fresh air or take them on drives, for persons who were caring for persons who might have been immobile, it was challenging trying to move them on their own. And also for persons who didn't have personal vehicles, it was difficult for them to take them on drives because they relied on public transportation. And also for those who use public transportation, they expressed fear and concern surrounding using the bus systems and taxis out of fear that they would bring the virus back home to their loved ones. In addition, due to the stay-at-home order that occurred, it was very challenging for some persons to transport their loved ones to medical support services. And as a result, some participants discussed having to pull on like services like ambulances to be able to transport their loved ones because they didn't have the personal vehicle available and they didn't want to use public transportation. So this represents an additional expense to be able to basically support the transport needs for their loved ones at that time. Accessing support services was also a challenge, and this was seen especially with medical support services. So participants expressed concerns about medication availability. At the start of the pandemic, there was a concern about just shipments and things being in stock locally. And for this participant, she was concerned that the medication that she uses to care for her loved one would not be available. However, she did express over time that as she spoke with her pharmacist, she was able to source a local option. Home doctor visits were also negatively impacted because you know that doctors, they're now on the front lines and they have less available time, and so participants discuss challenges having home doctor visits, which is actually crucial for the participants who are immobile and are unable to move. So this is what also led to the need for them to look for additional transport options because they weren't able to rely on the usual home visit practice that aided their care routines that they had already established. Other participants spoke about canceled doctor's appointments and how this impacted on further complications months after they missed the appointment, because persons are also managing other chronic diseases in addition to having dementia. There was also a reported difficulty in just accessing medical care for older persons at both health centers and hospitals. And this came about particularly when we had that first lockdown and older persons were not able to go out at all, because initially the ordinance was that they weren't really able to go out for like once a day to go to the grocery store, etc., even though that has been, they've been allocated that one moment now to be able to run those errands. And so at that time when that restriction was in place, participants discussed challenges getting the authorization to have their loved ones stay overnight at the hospital. And this was particularly challenging because medical care often results in the medical conditioning worsening. A big thing that came about with the pandemic for carers was this whole aspect of managing care, and managing care in terms of adjusting the household, adjusting the members in the household. So when you have a care system, it can involve a main carer, a paid carer, other family members, or even maybe a nurse in the home. However, given the fear around potentially infecting your loved ones, persons really had to try to figure out ways to limit contact with other family members while still providing the same quality of care that they provided. And so for some people, they discussed having to move their loved ones in certain areas of the house where there may be less traffic. And they've also discussed just completely cutting off visitors to the home. And this is visitors for not just the person living with dementia, but visitors also for the carer. And so, you know, this had a significant impact on their levels of social connection and their ability to engage with persons. Another issue was the fact of reduced wages. So given that these persons who are caring for their loved ones are unpaid carers, they are not being paid to provide care. And so the money that's coming that's coming to support care is coming from their basically their means of employment. And we all know that with COVID, this has significantly impacted persons' jobs. It's impacted their wages. And so as a result, people have now, these persons, they've had to figure out how to adjust and still provide care to persons with maybe less wages or not having a job at all, which is very challenging, especially given some of the extra additional expenses that they've had to take on, given some of the restrictions, the COVID-19 restrictions. Other participants also highlighted just the difficulty in sourcing care. So even though that there is a pandemic, you know, life still goes on, and sometimes their loved ones have complications, they have challenges, they might not be getting along with the person that they originally hired. And because of all the restrictions with social gatherings and just this concern about knowing whether someone is infected before bringing them into your home, just out of concern for your loved one's safety, it's led to challenges and difficulties in sourcing persons who can assist. And for some participants, having someone there is crucial because, for example, if you're caring for someone who's immobile, but they may be bigger in stature for you, it's very hard to move them on your own. And if you don't have support or family involved in the care, then it's very likely that you'll need to hire someone just to help you to provide that assistance in lifting them or moving them. And so this was a major cause of concern for them. Managing loss also came up as a major theme. So while none of our participants died from COVID, they did express how COVID had made the losses they experienced more difficult. So we did have some participants who lost their loved ones, and they spoke about the experience of not being able to be with them as much as they may have wanted, for those who may have utilized nursing homes. Other person spoke about just the challenges with funerals. So there's restrictions on how much people can be at a funeral. And also, you know, a lot of people have family members who live abroad, and it's just been very challenging trying to figure out, well, should we wait until they come back? Should we go ahead and do it now? And this caused us a lot of emotional distress for participants. And then even in terms of the person living with dementia, these persons are unable to attend the funeral. So even though the restrictions, you know, there's some concern around their ability to attend the usual practices, cultural practices that we have around grieving. And so you can see that there's been a lot of social and emotional costs that came with just navigating COVID-19 for carers and persons living with dementia. So the pandemic has highlighted both strengths and gaps in the care system. So we can see that some of the participants have tried to make the necessary adjustments to really just provide the care needed and support their loved ones through this crisis that, you know, disproportionately affects them and affects that age group. However, there are gaps that exist because persons had to struggle with loss of jobs, not being able to see their loved ones, or maybe not being able to access the support they need in providing care. They've also disclosed, you know, challenges with transportation and how this has impacted their ability to even source care if they knew where to go and access the resources. And I just want to highlight, you know, there has been a lot of community resources that were made available to older persons during the pandemic, because I think it's recognized, you know, that there needs to be the support in terms of the groceries, in terms of the prescription deliveries, things of that nature, just to support persons who may not be able to come outside as often or do their own shopping. However, is this sustainable in the long run? Unpaid carers of persons living with dementia have been shouldering costs from before COVID in terms of providing adequate care for their loved ones. And now with COVID, it just exasperates already strained setup that they had. And so these resources, while they're excellent, we really have to turn the conversation to something that's more sustainable. What are we doing to provide support for unpaid carers of persons living with dementia and for the long term, for COVID and beyond? So I want to send a thank you from the Stride Jamaica team, and feel free to drop any questions in the chat.
Thank you very much, Ms. Stubbs. I think we have gone into another dimension of a critical area in our routine life, our vulnerable population, generally speaking, our elderly population who are at home and having challenges in just basically staying at home in the context of COVID-19 and the response. So thank you very much, Ms. Stubbs, for highlighting an important area that we need the system as a whole to look into to provide for a particularly vulnerable group within our population. I believe it is that the participants are still able to provide questions and comments in the chat, and Ms. Stubbs will respond as best as possible to some of those comments, but we're going to take a few minutes for some questions or comments that may not have been adequately responded to in the chat certainly from Mrs. Whitehorn-Smith first, and if there's any other, Ms. Stubbs will come in and provide a verbal response over the sound system that we have. So Control, I don't know if there are any particular questions that may not have been addressed in the chat that you'd want to vocalize for us now, and then Mrs. Whitehorn-Smith and or Ms. Stubbs will respond.
All right, so to Ms. Stubbs, we just want to know if the nursing home participants were included in your studies.
Oh, she's going to have to come up, or we have a roving mic?
Ms. Stubbs.
Ms. Stubbs, okay.
So we did have participants who had loved ones in the nursing home. However, they weren't involved in some of the, we've seen in the news some of the challenges with the nursing homes and how some persons have contacted COVID-19 in the nursing homes. However, none of our participants were those persons. So they've had their loved ones in the nursing homes. However, for the most part, they're fine. They report that they're doing well.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Stubbs. That will be all for the questions for now. Thank you.
Okay. Mrs. Whitehorn-Smith, I think, has to respond to one of the questions. All right.
Okay. I just wanted to respond to a particular question I didn't get to adequately talk about in the chat. And that was someone asking about the link between religion or Christianity and depressive and anxiety symptoms. Normally, when we're doing the statistical analysis, if something doesn't come up as significant, we don't normally do further analysis into breaking down the different religious sects and what would have been significant or important there. So when we did analysis, religion didn't come up at all as an area where there were any notable differences between religious sects and depressive and anxiety symptoms, which means it was across the board. And the same went for area of residence, whether urban or rural. As it relates to marital status, someone asked about if there was I didn't speak to marital status in the table related to the multivariate analysis. So on its own, marital status as it relates to depressive symptoms and anxiety symptoms did come up as a association there, where persons who were single were more prone to having depressive and anxiety symptoms than persons who are married. However, when you do multivariate analysis, you use a model, and when it was put into that model along with the factors of age and education and employment, it wasn't strong enough of a factor in relation to those other factors. So it took dominance. Those factors took dominance over the marriage. So that was why it didn't show up in that particular one. Okay? Thank you.
Very good. Control, do we have any more that we need to respond to? Okay, great. I think we have done, we have a question in the room. Just 1 minute. Just a minute, just turn on the mic because I think they need to record it.
All right. The other countries involved in strike, this is for Ms. Stubbs. Did they collect data that you could compare with Jamaica? Do they have similar scenario with their with the caregiver experience? And how many homes did they kind of assess as it relates to those who had dementia and the caregiver's experience? Thank you.
Okay, Ms. Stubbs, did you get the question?
Okay, so just a point of clarification, our study actually focuses on the experiences of unpaid caregivers of persons living with dementia and not specifically on nursing homes. So while we do consider persons who utilize homes to enhance care, a unpaid caregiver, we are not focusing specifically on persons living with dementia who are cared for persons in the nursing home. So I just wanted to make that clear. So we engage with unpaid carers in this country, in Jamaica, and also in the other 7 countries. And so, yes, the other countries, we are all collecting similar data in terms of the research consists of 10 smaller work packages just aimed at exploring the realities of dementia care support in the 7 countries. And the countries have also begun, who engage with unpaid carers, those same countries have begun to follow in similar suits and contact persons just to get an understanding of what their experiences have been thus far with COVID. And so while there is certain nuances, culturally in the different countries, you do see some similarities in terms like just surrounding access to support services in those different countries.
I think just to summarize a bit, in the question really asked, have we been able to collect similar data for the other countries in the study? And the answer to that question is yes. And we will be able to analyze that information and present that data in a subsequent forum. So the answer, I trust your question was answered. Yes. And I think we are going to be able to close the question and answer segment. Just now, we have covered a very, very important area. We have closed off the 3rd segment on mental health focus on the COVID-19 and adjusting to the new norm, of which mental health is a critical area. We have focused, gathered information that both extremes of our population, the younger population being affected by the depressive and anxiety symptoms, so which we need to provide some kind of support, and our elderly population, certainly with a variety of other conditions, but we have looked today at those affected by dementia and the care system for them, and recognize that there is a challenge. So whilst we have highlighted strengths in the system, there are weaknesses, and in keeping with the objective of the conference, we've been able to identify areas where support can be provided to enhance, generally speaking, the well-being of our population affected by COVID-19. So we have made up in time, good time, I believe. We're running about 15 minutes now, so we have made up on some time. So I'm going to close off this segment, the 3rd scientific session, and hand over to directly or our next session just now, which is going to focus on sickle cell disease, and invite Professor Jennifer Knight-Madden to take the floor to moderate the next section, who I believe is joining us virtually.
Yes, thank you very much. Good morning, everybody, and thank you for staying for this next session, this next scientific session. Welcome to our participants, welcome to the viewers, both on Zoom as well as on the other forms of social media, such as Facebook and YouTube. And as we go through our session, I'd ask that you put your questions in the question and answer window in all those fora so that we can take the questions as we have time. Now, this is an exciting conference. We're hearing so many good projects, and in this session, we will hear the first 2 of 5 oral presentations by junior researchers at CARE Sickle Cell Unit. And these 2 will present data, some of the data from a larger study on pain, which you know is integral to sickle cell disease, and in particular, neuropathic pain. So the first speaker that we have is Dr. Ramsey, Dr. Zachary Ramsey. Dr. Ramsey he's a medical doctor and a research fellow at the Sickle Cell Unit. He graduated from UWI with his MBBS and worked at the Bustamante Hospital for Children before coming to join us here in 2017. At the unit, he has worked as an investigator on several projects, including clinical trials, examining subjects such as neuropathic pain, health expenses, hydroxyurea to prevent stroke, and a new drug, voxelotor, which has since been licensed. He is also currently a candidate for the MSc EPI at UE, having completed his coursework and submitted his project on time. Dr. Ramsey, please join us and speak to us on your topic, exploring acute, chronic, and neuropathic pain among Jamaicans with sickle cell disease.
Hi, morning. So I'm Zachary Ramsey, and I'm here to present to you today about, as Prof said, a study on pain in sickle cell disease. Now, pain is the hallmark disease complication, and it can present in different ways. So we know that in sickle cell, there's a genetic mutation that results in red blood cells becoming sickle-shaped when they get under cell stress, and that results in blood vessels becoming blocked. This is known as a vasoocclusion or vasoocclusive crisis, and those result in acute pain. Now, over time, when these happen recurrently and frequently, it can result in some of these inflammatory mediators persisting at the peripheral nerves, and it results in increased excitability at the peripheral nerves. Over time, that can result in changes in the central nervous system and the peripheral nerves and the skin that cause sickle cell patients to become more sensitive to pain. So they get sensitized, and that is known as neuropathic pain. Now, if you're more sensitized to pain, in addition to the contribution of these recurrent vasoocclusive crises, then you're more likely to develop persistent pain, which we consider as chronic pain. So we can see, sorry to go back, but we can see that the process of developing chronic pain in sickle cell disease is a vicious forward feed cycle. Now, acute pain, or these vasoocclusive crises, they are associated with significant morbidity. So we know that about 90% of sickle cell disease related admissions are due to them. And they're also frequent and severe. A large study found that as much as 16.2% of days were associated with crisis. Now, the International Association for the Study of Pain defines chronic pain as pain lasting 3 or more months, and 44% of sickle cell disease subjects were found to have chronic pain of at least mild intensity in a very large study. So we see that chronic pain pertains more to the pattern of pain. The ISP, on the other hand, defines neuropathic pain as pain caused by a lesion or disease of the somatosensory system. And so we can see that neuropathic pain is more related to the etiology of pain, so the thing that's causing it. Now, it is estimated to occur in between 25 to 40% of subjects with sickle cell disease in a recent review, and it has been found to be significantly associated with worse quality of life in a number of domains. Now, we understand that sickle cell pain is not just this acute nociceptive crisis that we're used to, but that it may also be neuropathic and chronic. And if we fail to identify these and treat them, we may be under-treating pain because the approach to treating these is different. In a recent study, Brandau found that as many as 40% of sickle cell disease subjects had neuropathic pain, but only 5% were on a drug that was specific for treating it. So we set out to do this study to describe acute pain in terms of its frequency and severity, to estimate the prevalence of chronic and neuropathic pain, to determine the factors that are associated with each pain type, and to characterize the different methods of pain control. So we did a cross-sectional study at the sickle cell unit, and as Prof mentioned, the findings that I'm presenting here are part of a larger study with other instruments. The study took place between July 2019 and March 2020, and we consecutively recruited subjects who were 14 years and older, who were not having a crisis at the time of the study. We also excluded persons who were pregnant or who had a history of clinical stroke, particularly because it would have affected one of the other instruments that were used, but I'm not going to speak to that one today. So we performed a study questionnaire ascertaining social and demographic factors. We also did hematology studies. The Ask Me questionnaire, which is a quality of life questionnaire validated for use in sickle cell disease, was used for a number of things. First of all, we defined acute pain based on the pain episode module. We looked on an overall score or a composite score that was used in our hypothesis testing, and we also calculated a frequency score and a severity score to compare it to the reference population. The sickle cell disease medical history checklist was done to assess sickle cell complications, and the pain impact module was done to assess how pain affects quality of life and daily activities. Now, the pain detect is validated to diagnose neuropathic pain in persons with lower back pain, and it has the advantage that it allows us to look on pain patterns so that we can assess chronic pain. Now, neuropathic pain was defined as anybody who had a score of more than 13, as defined by the authors, and we also defined persons as having chronic pain if they had any one of the persistent pain patterns. So we can see that 1, 2, and 4 are the persistent pain patterns. So either persistent pain with slight fluctuations, persistent pain with pain attacks, or pain attacks with pain between them. And then number 3 is the non-persistent pain pattern, that is just pain attacks without pain between them. So we categorized some variables, including age, body mass index. Genotypes were categorized as severe if the persons had SS, homozygous SS disease, or S-beta thalassemia not, and mild if they were SC or S-beta thalassemia plus. We assessed persons as using strong opioids if they used morphine, meperidine, or tramadol in the last 4 weeks. We performed all our analysis in state of 14.2, and our bivariate analyses included Pearson's chi-squared, Wilcoxon-Rank sum, and Kruskal-Wallis test. And for our multivariate analyses, we performed logistic regression analyses to assess the adjusted odds for neuropathic pain and chronic pain, and also an ANOVA model to look on the adjusted associations with the acute composite scores for acute pain. So we recruited 257 subjects, 55.6% were female, with a mean age of 31.7, ranging from 14 to 67. 80.5% of persons were homozygous SS disease. My apologies, 80.5% of persons were of a severe type of genotype. 9% used hydroxyurea, and 66.9% were from an urban type community. The age categories were distributed as shown. 28.8% of persons reported secondary school as their highest level of schooling, and the 54.7% of persons were employed. Now, body mass index, 55.7% of persons were of a normal body mass index, although we had some persons calculated as being overweight and obese. And the disease complications were as shown: current leg ulcers 13.6%, the spleen being damaged or removed 12.8%, the shoulder or hip being damaged 11.3%. Persons who took strong opioids in the last 4 weeks was 13.2%, and those who were taking pain medication every day was 8.6%. This is showing us the laboratory studies that we did. And as we can see, the median hemoglobin was 8.4, and the median reticulocyte count was 8.8. Now, the acute pain scores, the composite frequency and severity score that I mentioned before, their means all fell above the mid-range of possible scores. 92.6% of persons had a pain attack in their lifetime, including 72.4% that had it in the last year. Of those who had an attack in the last year, 23.7% reported having 4 or more, and 54.9% of persons were unable to carry out normal daily activities during their last crisis. So this is showing us the duration of pain at the last crisis. We can see that many persons reported 1 to 3 days. And this is showing us our intensity of pain at the last crisis. We can see that many persons reported having 10 out of 10 pain. So in terms of the pain patterns and the pain detect, we assessed 21.5% of persons as having persistent pain or chronic pain, and 17.9% of persons as having neuropathic pain. Many persons who had chronic pain also had neuropathic pain, so there was some overlap. So when we did not adjust for other factors, chronic pain was associated with females, higher body mass index categories, mild genotype, strong opioid use, and taking pain medication every day. It was also associated with higher hemoglobin and lower reticulocyte count when not adjusted. And in terms of neuropathic pain, when not adjusted, it was associated with females also, current leg ulcers, and strong opioid use. Acute pain, when not adjusted, had higher scores for the middle age group, strong opioids, persons who had their shoulders or hip damaged, persons who took pain medication every day, and we actually found lower scores in persons who had their spleen damaged or removed. So that was a lot to take in, but let's focus on the multivariate analysis. So when we adjusted for other factors in our logistic regression, we found that the adjusted odds for chronic pain were higher in persons who were in older age groups, mild genotypes, and those who took pain medication every day. For neuropathic pain, the adjusted odds in our logistic regression were higher for persons who were female, had current leg ulcers, and who used strong opioids. In an ANOVA model, when we adjusted for other factors, there were higher scores in persons who used strong opioids, persons who had shoulder or hip damage, and lower scores in persons who had their spleen damaged or removed. So just allowing you to summarize so that we can review, because I know that was a lot to show you at once, but the multivariate analysis for chronic pain, neuropathic pain, and acute pain scores. So we also looked at pharmacological management, and we found that 40% of persons used at least one strong opioid in the last 4 weeks, and 4 persons used neuropathic pain drugs, specifically gabapentin and amitriptyline. We saw that almost half of the sample reported using distraction, so distracting themselves with another activity to manage their pain, and it was more than 75% effective. Other methods were each less than 15% reported, but most of them were more than 50% reported as effective. So we found that acute pain was severe and frequent, but we did find that it was less so than the US reference population for the ASME questionnaire. There are a couple of things that could account for this. So higher temperatures have been associated with less pain. And since we have higher temperatures, that may be a reason that may account for that. There are certain genetic differences. So for example, polymorphisms in the beta-2 adrenergic receptor that have shown different pain outcomes in terms of acute pain, and that could be different between the two populations. We found that chronic pain and neuropathic pain are common, but we did find that it was less prevalent than in other studies in the literature. Some things that could account for that, first of all, it is possible that pain detect may underestimate neuropathic pain. In a recent study that was done, they compared it to other questionnaires that are used for assessing neuropathic pain, and they found that it actually had low estimates. Acute pain, we already discussed, may lead to neuropathic pain, and we have less of that, so that may be one reason. And as I'll discuss later, opioids may lead to neuropathic pain, and we use less opioids, so that could be another reason as well. In terms of chronic pain, we're actually measuring chronic pain differently than other studies do. So it is very difficult to make those comparisons. Older age was associated with chronic pain, but not neuropathic pain. And it is possible that these sensitization changes that I spoke about earlier start early in sickle cell disease, and that may explain why neuropathic pain is equal across the different age groups. But chronic complications may be contributing to chronic pain at older age groups, and that's why we see that association. And it is a consistent finding in the literature. So Santos, in a recent study, found that chronic pain increased from 10% to 40.9% as subjects got older. So females were found to have higher odds of neuropathic pain, and it is possible that there may be a hormonal influence and genetics that may be playing a role, because both menses and polymorphisms have been associated with different pain outcomes in women. Leg ulcers were associated with higher odds of neuropathic pain, and they do create the perfect environment in terms of tissue trauma and inflammatory mediators that set the setting for some of those sensitization changes to occur. And it is a consistent finding in patients without sickle cell disease that neuropathic pain is associated with leg ulcers. This is actually the first finding that we're seeing of the literature of it occurring in sickle cell disease, of that association occurring in sickle cell disease. Now, when the spleen was damaged or removed, acute pain frequency and severity was reduced. And since the spleen is a source of painful infarctions, when it is removed, it is possible that pain may resolve, but we would need more studies to confirm that. Now, we did find significant opioid use, but less so than in US studies. Opioid therapy, chronic opioid therapy has been found to cause pain, fatigue, depression, and some of those sensitization changes that I spoke about before in persons with sickle cell disease. So seeing as though opioid therapy may actually lead to neuropathic pain, we do need to consider reducing the amount that we're using in the clinic. So to conclude, chronic and neuropathic pain were found to be common, and we think that we need to screen more patients for it when we're in routine clinical practice. Opioid use was also very common, while the alternatives were not, and so we need to consider ways to reduce that. Some ways we can do that: we can utilize more targeted therapies like gabapentin for neuropathic pain, and we can also consider using more of those non-pharmacological methods like physiotherapy and massage that were considered to be effective. And we do think that we need more studies to assess some of these sex and genotype differences that we observed. Thank you. Just want to thank the sponsors and my co-authors and all the staff and patients of the Sickle Cell Unit.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ramsey. That was a very interesting presentation. And I think all of us who care for people with sickle cell disease are now rethinking those episodes. We've seen them come in with pain and wondered if perhaps we should have paid more attention to chronic pain or to neuropathic pain. Thank you very much for that. I ask that all the participants on the line continue to put their questions into the question and answer or into the chat, and the speakers will address them as we go along. And if we have time at the end, they'll also take questions orally. We're now going to move on to the second talk in this session, which is by Ms. Rachel Bartlett. Now, Ms. Bartlett is a registered nurse, and she obtained her Bachelor of Science in Nursing from the University of West Indies just the other day in 2017, and she's currently employed here at the unit. Over the last year, she coordinated a study that examined the prevalence of neuropathic pain in our population and its features and its impact. However, Due to her interest and hard work, she grew from coordinating the technical aspects of the study to contributing significantly to the intellectual aspects of the study, and has learned additional research skills by being integral to the analysis and reporting of the work. She has a keen interest in clinical research and hopes to pursue further training in epidemiology. She speaks to us today about women at risk, health-related quality of life, disease severity, and neuropathic pain in sickle cell disease in Jamaica. Ms. Bartlett?
Thank you very much, Professor. Good morning, everyone. Okay. Good morning again. My name is Rachel, as you heard, and today I'll be presenting on the theme, Women at Risk, Health-Related Quality of Life, Disease Severity, and Neuropathic Pain in Sickle Cell Disease. Sickle cell disease is the result of the inheritance of the sickle cell gene and involves the polymerization of the hemoglobin and distortion of the red blood cell when it is deoxygenated. This results in occlusion of the small blood vessels, leading to ischemia, inflammation, debilitating pain, and damage to multiple organ systems. Sickle cell disease is the commonest inherited blood disorder worldwide, with 10% of the population in Jamaica carrying the sickle gene, and 1 in 150 babies are born with sickle cell disease. Previously, sickle cell disease was a cause of high childhood mortality. However, with the introduction of newborn screening, penicillin and vaccine prophylaxis, and education, in some places, childhood mortality has been significantly reduced. Consequently, patients with sickle cell disease are living longer. With older age, chronic manifestations of the disease are emerging with significant impacts on health-related quality of life. Among all the consequences of sickle cell disease, pain is the commonest complication reported. In fact, Dampier et al. In 2011 found that pain impacted health-related quality of life more than any other complication of the disease. And this was mirrored in Jamaica, where frequent painful crises was shown to negatively impact health-related quality of life and was associated with higher levels of depression. To compound the problem, emerging evidence suggests that chronic pain and neuropathic pain contribute to the overall pain burden in sickle cell disease, and likely this impacts health-related quality of life. The prevalence of neuropathic pain is estimated to be as high as 25 to 40%. Health-related quality of life in patients with sickle cell disease is very seriously compromised and has been found to be worse when compared to patients with other serious chronic illnesses like asthma, cystic fibrosis, and those on hemodialysis. And this happened even when the patient with sickle cell disease was of a younger age. For all these reasons, sickle cell disease remains a public health concern. And because gaps exist in the understanding of its impact on health-related quality of life in adults living with sickle cell disease, especially with the emergence of neuropathic pain, we aim to assess the health-related quality of life of adolescents and adult Jamaicans with sickle cell disease and identify its associations with socio-demographic and clinical factors, especially neuropathic pain. Onto the methods. This report arises from a larger cross-sectional study that examined the prevalence and correlates of neuropathic pain in Jamaicans with sickle cell disease. By consecutive sampling well patients ages 14 years and older who attended the sickle cell unit between July 2019 and March 2020 were recruited. Those with acute illness, current pregnancy, and a history of clinical stroke were excluded from the study because of the impact those characteristics were felt to have on testing, which is beyond the scope of this presentation. A sample size of 254 was calculated based on the 25% estimated prevalence of neuropathic pain. Neuropathic pain was assessed using a 10-item screening tool called the Dolor Neuropathy 4 or DM4. It contains 7 items that capture patient-reported experiences and 3 items that capture clinical investigations of hypoesthesia and allodynia. The health-related quality of life was measured using a patient-reported outcome measurement tool called AskMe. And AskMe evaluates the physical, mental, and social health of adults with sickle cell disease across 5 impact domains using a Likert scale. And it contains scores for a referent population of 556 adults with sickle cell disease. So higher scores on the impact domains indicate improved functioning in that domain. The disease severity scores were calculated using the AskMe medical history checklist. On that checklist, higher scores imply worse disease severity. And a combined pain score was calculated using the AskMe pain episode frequency and severity scores. And again, higher scores implied worse outcomes. Stata 14.2 was used for statistical analysis of means, frequencies, t-tests, ANOVA, and linear regressions. These are our results. There were 257 respondents, of which 56% were female, and the average age of respondents was approximately 32 years. 64% of them were never married, and 54.7% were employed. When you look at this pie chart, we've displayed the genotypes, and we can see that HBSS accounts for the greater majority of the participants, followed by HBSC. When we come over to the bar chart, we see commonly known complications of the disease like leg ulcers, kidney damage. It still present in the population with significant prevalences, but we also see the emergence of neuropathic pain, overweight and obesity at high prevalences in the population. The AskMe scores in the current study were greater than the AskMe scores of the referent population, and they were significantly better than a UK population as well in all impact domains. Among socio-demographic characteristics, women have worse AskMe scores than men in all domains, and significantly so in sleep, emotional, and stiffness impact. Similarly, the AskMe scores for the age group 25 to 39 were worse in all domains, and significantly worse outcomes were observed on emotional and stiffness impact. However, those in stable, intimate partnerships had better functioning, especially in the social function domain. On bivariate analysis, those who had neuropathic pain had worse outcomes in all except sleep. Current leg ulcers and AVN also negatively impacted health-related quality of life in a number of domains, and obesity was significantly associated with worse stiffness impact. The variables that were significant on bivariate analyses were plugged into multiple regression models, and these were our findings. Those with worse pain scores and disease severity had worse function in all domains. And significantly accounting for worse outcomes on social function was having genotype HBSC, looking for employment, and the presence of neuropathic pain. Also, women with leg ulcers were seen to have worse outcomes in this domain. Conversely, stable intimate relationships were associated with improved social functioning. Worse outcomes on emotional impact was seen in those of age group 25 to 39 and those looking for employment and having neuropathic pain. Females, those who were obese and those who had neuropathic pain had worse scores on the stiffness domain than their counterparts. Interestingly, HBSC and those looking for employment had worse pain impact. We also found that though sex was not a significant predictor of worse pain impact, women who were looking for employment did have worse functioning. Females who were obese and those who had neuropathic pain had worse stiffness. onto the discussion. ASME scores in our population were higher than the UK and the referent populations, which suggests better functioning in our sample. A partial explanation for this is that our study population was younger and had a larger proportion of males. The prevalence of neuropathic pain is high and has significant implications for health-related quality of life. This mirrors results from the only other study looking at the impact of neuropathic pain on health-related quality of life in sickle cell disease. And coming out of Brazil, where neuropathic pain was associated with impaired functioning on all quality of life domains. In general, neuropathic pain has been associated with high financial cost its management, lower work productivity, and poor quality of life. And the management of neuropathic pain differs from the management of other pain phenotypes in sickle cell disease, and is resistant to the commonly used analgesics. And of course, this has implications for clinical practice. The impact of sickle cell disease on sleep and stiffness is a relatively new area of assessment. Although patients with sickle cell disease are typically underweight, the emergence of overweight and obesity in the population is associated with poorer sleep and greater stiffness. Its association with sleep was captured by Sharma et al. In 2015, who found that levels of insomnia and sleep disorder breathing in sickle cell disease was high, and that the average BMI of patients with sleep disordered breathing was 32.6 kilograms per meter squared. Where stiffness is concerned, obesity has been shown to be a contributor to inflammation and osteonecrosis in the general population and may affect patients with sickle cell disease in a similar manner. Now, females in Jamaica are at higher risk of significantly poorer health-related quality of life and mental health, and this is an established trend in previous studies. We found that females were more likely to be overweight and obese, and this carries the weight of the implications previously discussed. And they were also more likely to report poorer functions in all domains, especially when leg ulcers and unemployment were factors. These observations may be attributable to the unique gender roles and cultural expectations of women. And while further studies are required to establish causation, these findings beg for gender-specific focus during clinical encounters and research to improve the health-related quality of life of women. In conclusion, the impact of sickle cell disease on health-related quality of life is sufficiently significant for improvements to health-related quality of life to be regarded an essential clinical outcome. And longer life expectancy in sickle cell disease is associated with the emergence of chronic complications such as neuropathic pain and obesity. And neuropathic pain is associated with poorer health-related quality of life, especially in psychosocial domains. And there is a higher risk of poor functioning in women. And this suggests the need for routine clinical screening for neuropathic pain and obesity, and the incorporation of appropriate therapies and nutritional counseling. These findings also support gender-targeted approach in clinical care, and also demonstrate the needs for further interventions to improve the health-related quality of life of women. And also the incorporating of psychological support and social assistance into the treatment management of sickle cell disease is paramount. I would like to acknowledge my co-authors, Drs. Ramsey, Ali, Grant, Rankin Mullings, Gordon Strawn, and Professor Monica Asnani, and also special thanks to the patients and staff of the Sickle Cell Unit who facilitated this study. These are my references. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Nurse Bartlett. Another excellent presentation from the team. And I think everybody listening will join me in saying it's amazing that this young nurse has done such, participated actively in such work. This brings to the close this session. Please stay tuned for the next session, which Dr. Crawford will moderate, which also deals with sickle cell disease presentations. Just want to remind you to go onto the website, the webpage, and look at the conference booklet, look at the posters, and also to complete the conference evaluation form. Thank you so much for participating in this session. I'm going to hand over now to Dr. Croft. Oh, do we have any time for questions? Controller, I know Dr. Ramsey has been answering them in the Q&A, but do we have any other questions that we need to take now? Or for either Nurse Bartlett or for Dr. Ramsey?
Yes, there is one question for Ms. Bartlett. Did any of your findings found any association with autoimmune diseases?
Testing, we didn't test for autoimmune conditions, so we wouldn't be able to comment on any of those conditions.
Okay, thank you. And I just want to point out that many of the questions have been answered in the Q&A section, so you may go in and see the answers for the questions. Thank you.
All right, thank you. So we heard from Dr. Ramsey how important the different kinds of pain are, and we heard from Nurse Bartlett that pain doesn't just hurt. It actually can take over and affect not just the biological part of your life, but the social and the psychological. Thank you very much to both presenters, and thank you for your attention. I hand over to Dr. Crawford.
A pleasant morning to everyone, and welcome to the 5th scientific session on sickle cell disease. And overall welcome to you to the 11th annual conference of the Ministry of Health and Wellness. This international conference this year, as you already know, bears the theme, the COVID-19 experience, adjusting to the new normal. Today, I am fortunate and feel honored to actually have on my team of panel Drs. Nikki Chin and Dr. Zachary Ramsey. Dr. Nikki Chin is the first presenter of this segment. She is going to tell you how her study aims to examine the relationship between self-reported quality of sleep and health-related quality of life in adult patients with sickle cell diseases attending the sickle cell unit in Jamaica. Dr. Nikki Chin is a physician who obtained her Bachelor of Medicine and Bachelor of Surgery degree at the University of the West Indies, Mona, in 2010. She is presently completing her Doctor of Medicine degree in Family Medicine. Hearty congratulations to her. She has been working at the sickle cell unit of the Caribbean Institute of Health Research. Many of you know that unit to be TMRI. Since 2014, contributing to the clinical management of persons with sickle cell disease in Jamaica and with educating persons about this said disease. In partial fulfillment of her Doctor of Medicine degree, she conducted a study whereby she investigates the relationship between sleep quality and quality of life in adults with sickle cell disease in Jamaica. Her professional interests are in clinical research and patient education. She enjoys playing steel pan, and ladies and gentlemen, if we knew, we would have had her entertain us today. She also enjoys watching films and doing the DIY project. Put your hands together and welcome a very important lady, Dr. Nikki Chin.
Hello, good morning, everyone. Thank you for that introduction. So I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to speak today. My name is Nikki Chin, and I will be presenting on the relationship between sleep quality and quality of life in adults with sickle cell disease in Jamaica. Sorry. Okay, so this will be the outline that I will be following for my presentation today. So sleep is a necessary biological function which is important for general health, and poor sleep quality may negatively affect quality of life. Multiple factors have been shown to affect sleep quality, and poor sleep quality can negatively impact the quality of life of those with chronic illnesses, with outcomes such as poor disease control and increased complications experienced. Sickle cell disease is one such chronic illness. It is the most common genetic hemoglobinopathy affecting millions, with 300,000 born worldwide each year. Sickle cell disease complications are variable, with multiple factors influencing this variability. Severe morbidity is usually associated with poor health-related quality of life. Regarding sickle cell disease and sleep, numerous studies done in children have shown that there is increased prevalence of obstructive sleep apnea, and those affected had lower mean hemoglobin levels, increased risk of infection, and other complications. Studies done in adults have shown many had poor quality of sleep, sleep disorder breathing, and sleep apnea, and those affected had increased pain frequency and hospitalization, as well as lower health-related quality of life scores. So not many studies have been done in adults with sickle cell disease, and none have been done in Jamaica, not many sleep studies have been done in adults with sickle cell disease, and none have been done in Jamaica, where the disease affects 1 in every 150 live births. Previous studies done in Jamaican adults with sickle cell disease have shown that quality of life is reduced compared to that of the general population, with multiple factors contributing, but we did not know how sleep quality would influence it. The aims of this study were to determine the sleep quality and examine its predictors in the Jamaican adults with sickle cell disease, and to determine the relationship, if any, between sleep quality and quality of life in adults with sickle cell disease. So a cross-sectional study was done using convenient sampling at the sickle cell unit of the University of the West Indies. We included persons who were 18 years and older and who were in well state of health to participate when they presented to the clinic. We excluded those who were acutely ill and persons who had significant cognitive impairment. Using Reasoft, the sample size was calculated as 172, and we added a 10% refusal rate. Ethical approval was obtained from the Mona Campus Research Ethics Committee, and data collection was from August 2019 to January 2020. Interviewer-administered questionnaires were used, and body mass index was measured for each participant. The Pittsburgh Sleep Quality Index, or the PSQI, is a 9-item questionnaire with a global score range of 0 to 21. Those having a global score of 5 or greater are assessed as having poor sleep quality. As a screening tool, the PSQI, As a screening tool, the PSQI has a diagnostic sensitivity of 89.6% and a specificity of 86.5% for poor sleep quality. The Adult Sickle Cell Quality of Life Measurement Information System, or the ASME, is used to evaluate the physical, mental, and social well-being of adults with sickle cell disease, with those having higher scores in the impact domains having better quality of life. Of note, persons defined as having severe disease in the study were those having a medical history score greater than the mean of the study population plus 1 standard deviation. The study data was analyzed using STATA 14.0. The developers' guidelines were used to calculate the respective scores for the instruments used. Descriptive statistics were used for the sociodemographic and clinical characteristics of the study population, and bivariate and multivariate linear regression models were used. So to go through the results, of 177 adults recruited, the ages ranged from 18 to 66, with a mean age of 34.2. There were 112 females and 65 males. Secondary education was the highest achieved, and 66.1% of the study population were employed. 75.1% of the study population had HBSS genotype, and the mean BMI was 22.1 kilograms per meter square, with most participants being in the normal category. 26 persons were found to have severe disease as previously defined by using the Ask Me Medical History score. The mean global PSQI score was 7, with 66.1% having greater than or equal to 5, indicating poor sleep quality. So looking at the bivariate analysis, poor sleep quality was found in more females, in those who were employed, and in those in the overweight BMI category. Comparing sexes, 72.3% of females had poor sleep quality compared to 55.4% of males. Looking at employment status, 68.4% of those employed had poor sleep quality compared to the lowest category, which was 31.2, with those who were unemployed and looking. And for body mass index, 90% of those who were overweight and 83.3% of those who were obese were found to have poor sleep quality. Of note, the mean BMI of those with poor sleep quality was 2.33 kilograms per meter square, more than those who had good sleep quality, though both BMI means were noted to fall within the normal BMI categories. Using logistic regression, we found that being overweight and the disease severity score were significant predictors for poor sleep quality, with there being a 4-fold increase in the risk of poor sleep quality with those who were overweight and a 40% increase with each increase in the unit of disease severity. Interestingly, being unemployed and looking seemed to lower the risk of poor sleep by 25%. For disease severity and quality of life, all components of the Ask Me showed significant.
This meeting of the Honorable Senate of Friday, November 20th, 2020 is hereby called to order. Statements by ministers. Announcements.
Laid on the table of the Senate today is a copy of the report of the compliance audit of the Constituency Development Fund.
Thank you. Bills brought from the Honorable House of Representatives.
The following is a message from the Speaker of the House of Representatives to the Honorable Senate. I have the honor to advise the Honorable Senate that on the 7th day of November 2020, the following bills were passed in the House of Representatives. A bill entitled An Act to Amend the Bank of Jamaica Act. A bill entitled An Act to Repeal the Dogs Liability for Injuries by Act and to provide for liability for attacks by dogs and for connected matters, and a bill entitled An Act to Amend the Shipping Act. Signed, Marisa Wimple Philibert, MP, Speaker of the House of Representatives.
Mr. President, I signify my willingness to take charge of the bills.
A bill entitled An Act to Amend the Bank of Jamaica Act for the first time. A bill entitled An Act to Repeal the Dogs Liability for Injuries by Act and to provide for liability for attacks by dogs and for connected matters for the first time. And a bill entitled An Act to Amend the Shipping Act for the first time.
Mr. President, I beg to give notice of second reading of the bills.
Thank you, Minister. Petitions, papers, reports from committees, notices of motions given orally, questions and answers to questions, Motions that may be made at the commencement of public business requiring notice. Motions relating to the sitting of the Senate. Motions for leave to introduce bills. The presentation of bills without the leave of the Senate first obtained. Public business. Minister.
Mr. President, are you able to hear from me? Mr. President, the matter before the Senate at this time is the Act to amend the Revenue Administration Act 2020, which was passed in the House of Representatives, passed in that other place, on November 10th, 2020, and drafted pursuant to a cabinet decision of December 2017. This bill, Mr. President, seeks to incorporate into domestic law the Common Reporting Standard, which I'll refer to as the CRS, of Automatic Exchange of Information, AEOI, as well as the text of the Convention on the Mutual Administrative Assistance in Tax Matters, which I'll refer to as the MAAC in this presentation. Mr. President, these amendments are intended to increase transparency, ensuring that Jamaica is a safe place to do business in keeping with the global standard. This is, of course, consistent with Vision 2030 for Jamaica and will certainly aid our efforts to achieve the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. By way of background, Mr. President, exchange of information between revenue authorities has been a long-standing part of the legal and domestic landscape in Jamaica, forming the basis of an article in our double taxation agreements, as well as being the subject of standalone bilateral tax information exchange agreements. However, in the aftermath of the global financial crisis, the political momentum with respect to international tax matters, it shifted towards opportunities provided by automatic exchange of information. And as such, in September 2013, the G20 finance ministers and central bank governors determined the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act, known as FATCA, was approved in 2013 and it was introduced in 2015 in Jamaica, providing for the reciprocal automatic exchange of banking information between Jamaica and the United States. This was and is a bilateral arrangement. But by 2014, more than 104 jurisdictions had committed to swiftly implement a multilateral automatic exchange of information through the MAAC using the Common Reporting Standard platform, the CRS. The MAAC is a multilateral convention that was designed as an instrument of international law to facilitate all forms of administrative cooperation. It contains strict rules of confidentiality and proper use of information and permits, as indicated, automatic exchange of information. One of its main advantages lies in its global reach with 141 signatories as at September 1, 2020. Mr. President, Jamaica signed the MAAC in 2016. We ratified it in 2018, and it entered into force on March 3rd, 2019. Few years, 2 or 3 years, many other Caribbean countries, including Barbados and Trinidad, updated their domestic legislation and operationalized automatic exchange of information under the MAAC using the CRS platform. And we appreciate that while these and other countries may have faced external pressures to do so, Jamaica was not seen and has not been seen as a harmful jurisdiction by the international tax community and has in fact